issue of more importance to members of Congress than the issue of war and peace, and when it is appropriate to send the young people of our country into harm's way, knowing that some of them may not return home alive. And it goes without saying that every armed conflict that the United States of America is engaged in must be consistent with the Constitution of the United States and be lawful. Let us make no mistake about it. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states in no uncertain terms that Congress shall have power to declare war. Congress shall have power to declare war. The Founding Fathers gave the power to declare war to Congress, the branch most accountable to the people. For far too long, Congress, under Democratic and Republican administrations, has abdicated its constitutional role in authorizing war. The time is long overdue for Congress to reassert its constitutional authority. And that is what Senators Lee, Senator Murphy, and I are doing with this privileged resolution that we are introducing. Many Americans are unaware that the people of Yemen are suffering today in a devastating civil war, with Saudi Arabia and their allies on one side and Houthi rebels on the other. In November of this year, the United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator said that Yemen was on the brink of, quote, the largest famine the world has seen for many decades, end quote. So far, at least 10,000 civilians have died and over 40,000 have been wounded in the war, and 3 million people have been displaced. Many Americans are also not aware that U.S. forces have been actively involved in support of the Saudis in this war, providing intelligence and aerial refueling of planes whose bombs have killed thousands of people and made this crisis far worse. We believe that as Congress has not declared war or authorized military force in this conflict, the United States' involvement in Yemen is unconstitutional and unauthorized, and U.S. military support of the Saudi coalition must end. Without congressional authorization, our engagement in this war should be restricted to providing desperately needed humanitarian aid and diplomatic efforts to resolve it. That is why today, Senator Lee and I and Senator Murphy are introducing a joint resolution pursuant to the 1973 War Powers Resolution calling for an end to U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. The War Powers Resolution defines the introduction of U.S. armed forces to include, quote, the assignment of members of such armed forces to command, coordinate, participate in the movement of, or accompany the regular or irregular forces of any foreign country of government when such military forces are engaged or there exists an imminent threat that such forces will become engaged in hostilities, end of quote. Assisting with targeting intelligence and refueling airplanes as they bomb these targets clearly meets this definition. This is not a partisan issue. Support for the Saudi intervention in Yemen began under a Democratic president and has continued under a Republican president. Senator Lee is a conservative Republican. I am a progressive independent who caucuses with the Democrats. In November of last year, the House of Representatives, with a strong bipartisan vote, voted overwhelmingly for a non-binding resolution stating that U.S. involvement in the Yemen civil war is unauthorized. Only 30 members of the House voted against that resolution, and that is what we are saying today. We are in agreement with the vast majority of the Democrats and Republicans in the House. Here is the bottom line. If the President or members of Congress believe that support for this war is in the U.S. interest and that we should be involved in it, then let them come before Congress, let them make their case, and let the Congress vote on whether or not we stay in that war. I believe that we have become far too comfortable with the United States engaging in military interventions all over the world. We have now been in Afghanistan for 17 years, the longest war in American history. Our troops are now in Syria under what I believe are questionable authorities and the administration has indicated that it may broaden that mission even more. The time is long overdue for Congress to reassert its constitutional role in determining when and where our country goes to war, and I'm very proud to be working with Senator Lee and Senator Murphy on this vitally important issue. Senator Lee.
Importantly, this legislation is neither liberal nor conservative. It's neither Democratic nor Republican. This is an American principle, a constitutional principle, but it's constitutional in a uniquely American way. As James Madison explained in Federalist 69, one of the things that would come to differentiate the American form of government, the American republic, from the monarchy, from our old system of government prior to the Revolution, was that our chief executive would not be exclusively empowered to initiate war. Instead, there would be a shared power, a power belonging to the people's elected representatives in Congress, the branch of government most accountable to the people, elected at regular intervals. And that power would be shared with the president's power as commander-in-chief. Now, there are, of course, some gray areas in between where the president's power as commander-in-chief ends and where the Congress's power to declare war begins. It's one of the reasons why the War Powers Act of 1973 was adopted, in order to identify where those spaces overlap, where they intersect. And that's what we're addressing here. This particular conflict in which the United States is providing assistance to a Saudi-led coalition against the Houthis in Yemen is a good example of how something can become an interbranch issue rather than a Republican versus Democratic issue. Our involvement commenced, of course, during President Obama and has continued during the current presidency. This involvement is therefore not the creation of either political party. But over the course of the last few decades, there has been a steady erosion due to the willingness on the part of members of Congress to acquiesce to executive authority in this area. And so it's important that we address this from time to time, especially when American lives are being put on the line and American resources are being devoted toward a particular conflict. The American people have every right and every reasonable expectation that their elected representatives in Congress will debate this and will discuss this rather than simply allowing it to happen. We're involved in mid-air refueling. We're involved in identifying targets. We are involved in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. These are all things that are very significant in that we're providing material assistance to a Saudi-led coalition in the involvement in a civil war in Yemen. The American people have every right to expect that we would do something about this and that we would exercise our power pursuant to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and consistent with the War Powers Act of 1973. That's what this legislation does. And it's not every day that Senator Sanders and Senator Murphy and I come together on something, but we firmly agree on this, underscoring the fact that this is not a partisan issue. This is instead a constitutional issue which we stand behind wholeheartedly.
Yes.
Thanks so much for doing this. Two questions. First, when the House tried
Sorry, you are?
Oh, pardon me. Brian Harris with Al Monitor. We cover Middle East, North Africa. When the House tried to do this last autumn, it was also pursuant to the War Powers Resolution and theoretically guaranteed a floor vote. Obviously, the two chambers have different rules, but House leadership basically attempt to strip it of that privileged status. Do you have guarantees from Leader McConnell and Chairman Corker that this actually will go to the floor? And also, on kind of the basis of your argument that mid-air refueling qualifies as hostilities, you know, the U.S. has not directly itself targeted the Houthis, you know, fortunately there have been no U.S. deaths in this campaign against the Houthis. So how confident are you with your legal argument on this?
Well, first of all, the term hostilities is not defined itself in the War Powers Act. The War Powers Act does trigger our authority whenever we put our armed services personnel into a situation where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. These are the kinds of circumstances in which hostilities are involved. And we're also putting our armed forces personnel and equipment into territory, airspace, or waters of a foreign nation while prepared for combat. Those things themselves implicate the War Powers Act.
I honestly believe that if you look at the War Powers Act, that what the United States is doing now constitutes being involved in a military action in violation of that act. I think that's pretty clear. Yeah.
Senators, I'm Karen Diversion with the Washington Post. Two questions that are related, I guess. One, I was hoping that you could just go through the procedure of what has to happen to bring this up in the Senate to get those of us who are less young back up to speed. And also, you mentioned Afghanistan, Syria, but you're not addressing those first. You're focusing on Yemen. So why this conflict to do this? There's been talk of AUMS and other things for years in the Senate. So why this now?
Well, let me start off. As I understand the process, we are going to be introducing this resolution. The Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs has 10 days to discharge it. If it does not, one of us will be on the floor asking for its discharge at a time that we think appropriate, and then we begin the debate. Getting back to your question, what will Senator McConnell do? I don't know if Mike has additional information, but if, in fact, he chooses not to let us go forward and tries to table this resolution, then, in fact, the tabling will be a vote on the essence of what we're talking about. In terms of Syria, I have, speaking only for myself, serious concerns, but I think the point that Senator Lee made, which I very strongly agree with, it's not just Yemen, and it's not just Syria, and it's not just Afghanistan. What it is the fundamental principle of what entity of government decides whether or not we go to war. And the Constitution is quite clear that that must be the United States Congress and not simply the President.
Senator, for you, though, why Yemen and not
Well, we have to deal with these conflict by conflict. It wouldn't make any sense to put out one resolution dealing with every issue. It makes sense to address it one at a time, and that's why we're addressing it this way.
And it's the principle. It's the principle. If we can establish this principle, it will be a significant departure from past foreign policy in the United States.
Do you believe there's more support for establishing principle on Yemen, though, than these other conflicts that are out there? Do you feel more boosted?
Well, I look at it not so much as to the particular country, but the principle involved. And Yemen is as good a place to start as any. Yeah, ma'am.
Ellen Mitchell from The Hill. This goes back to the first question. Do you have any commitments from Senate leadership to bring this up on the floor?
Mike.
No, and that's why we're going to utilize our procedural rights, and we'll see where that takes us.
Have you discussed this at all?
I've discussed with my colleagues, including him, that I'm going to be bringing up this legislation.
What was his reaction to that?
You'll have to ask him.
Okay. Good. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.